Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi nui ki a koutou. Nau mai, haere mai, ki te whare wānanga o Tamaki Makaurau. Māori a mai o koutou nākou, o koutou hingangaro, o koutou wairoa. Nō reira, nau mai, haere mai, koutou. Welcome everyone to the University of Auckland and to this panel discussion titled Kindness versus Shame. I'm going to do the verses like this because I think we're challenging the verses this evening. Why emotions matter in politics and policy. So this event is sponsored by the Public Policy Institute and the Agencies of Kindness Research Hub, both of which are housed in the Faculty of Arts here at the University. My name's Jennifer Curtin, and I'm going to be your chair for this evening. And there are a number of reasons why we thought now is a good time to have a conversation about the connections between kindness and politics. With the change of government in 2017, Aotearoa New Zealand witnessed a widening of the political discourses used to describe approaches to particular policies and constituencies. Now, in addition to those that blame and shame, or invoke an us versus them position as to who is or isn't deserving, a number of politicians, including our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Green MP Chlöe Swarbrick, who's here tonight, speak about the importance of kindness, of compassion, and of inclusivity. For many in 2017, and again after the Christchurch massacre, this was a refreshing reset, one that gave some voters hope and a sense that politics and policy in New Zealand could be done differently in the world where radical right politics was abounding. Is that a word? Or maybe not. That working from a mix of emotion and reason was necessary to ensure a humane response to material inequality and tragedy. However, not all are convinced. There are still questions about how the rhetoric of kindness translates into public policy programs, into something tangible. There are questions about whether delivering a human form of capitalism or a human face of capitalism is possible, assuming everyone accepts it is even desirable. So to consider these issues and more in advance of this next election in 2020 and the day after International Working Women's Day, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce our four speakers for this evening. On my left, Michael Orsini. He's a professor of politics and is at the Institute for Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's also visiting the University of Queensland and has popped across the Tasman to visit us during his time in Australia. So Michael has a long research background in the politics of emotions and how they're reflected, in particularly with respect to health policy in areas such as autism, obesity and HIV/AIDS. Chlöe Swarbrick needs no introduction. She's a list MP from Auckland. Can you be a list MP from a geographical region?
If you get it signed off. Yeah, it has to go through publicity in Parliament.
Yeah, and has been a Green MP in Parliament and has championed a range of issues that are really important to many of us and which are imbued, we might argue, with a lot of emotion. Third, in order of speaking, is Helen Robinson. So Helen is General Manager at the Auckland City Mission and has a passion for resolving what is becoming a really important and wicked policy problem, that of food insecurity. And so you may have heard Helen speaking quite a lot about this issue in advance of Christmas holidays. And it's one that sometimes gets overlooked and very individualised. And so we're really pleased to have you here today, Helen. And last but not least is Mark Powell. Mark's an adjunct professor with the business school here at the University of Auckland. And before that was CEO of the Warehouse. And as part of his role, worked overseeing a range of what we might call kind and generous policies towards workers. So what we're going to do this evening is, rather than have everybody talk ad nauseum for a really long time, we are asking our speakers to talk succinctly for 10 minutes each on the elements of this topic that speak to the kinds of issues that they're passionate about. So not everyone will have the same take. And then we're going to open it up to the floor. And you can either ask questions from the floor with your hand, or you can be technologically savvy and follow the instructions above my head. And I will collate your Slido questions on this contraption here and read them out on your behalf if you would prefer to do it that way. Just for your information, we're recording this event this evening because there was an expression from a lot of people through social media that they too would like to hear what our speakers had to say. Once we're done, which is about 6:45 or thereabouts, I'm going to ask Dr. Alice Mills from Criminology, who's helped us put this together this evening to close the event. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Kia ora koto.
Oh, a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit of feedback there. Okay, I'll step. First of all, thanks for the invitation. Really pleased to be part of this panel and an important conversation to be having with a range of folks from the community who are really leading the way. As a Canadian, I claim very, very limited knowledge of the politics in this place. So I just want to state that as a big caveat. Please don't hold it against me. So I'm going to sort of talk about how discourses of kindness and shame have played out in the work that I've done as a researcher, and the value that comes with shifting that language, and how I think different emotions constrain or enable progressive, inclusive policy outcomes and programs. But being an academic, I just want to sort of ask a question about the question, and I think for me it's really important to think, to clarify that we have to, it's really difficult to speak definitively about this or that emotion because emotions are shifting. They're difficult to pin down. They move across different contexts. They move across different communities, geographic contexts. So as a Canadian, I'm embedded in a particular emotion culture. I think there's some interesting parallels maybe with the leadership of this country and the leadership of my country. But I am unfamiliar, and emotions resonate in different kinds of ways depending upon where we're coming from and where we're sort of socially situated. That doesn't mean we try to give up on understanding them. I think it's just important to be cautious in trying to speak about emotions that are universal, claim to be universal. And normally when we try to do that, we just get into a lot of trouble. So it's a bit, I think, of our own arrogance that leads us to think that whatever we are feeling, other people must be feeling too. So I want to caution against that. So I'm doing work on mention obesity, which is I use in scare quotes, and I've been working on HIV and also looking at disability policy and criminal justice policy. So I'll talk a little bit, but I don't have time to sort of say much. But just to talk a little bit about the work on obesity, I'm not sure how prominent that is in the New Zealand sort of context, but in that area, there's a real shortage, a relatively short supply of kindness. The folks who are often the target of the policies and the interventions are the targets of shame. And sometimes the shame is disguised in a kind of thin veneer of compassion and care. And I was speaking last week, I was talking about how even using the term obesity is so politically loaded for folks who don't identify with highly medicalized discourse that being told that you have to eat less and move more is a really, really painful thing for folks to have to hear. So when we talk about public health approaches that are interested in compassion, that compassion is often a way of kind of pathologizing, infantilizing people who have struggles that are difficult to understand and must be understood in a particular context in which they find themselves. So I'm interested in how policy becomes mobilized and feelings become mobilized against folks who are in particularly vulnerable positions in society. And that's sort of what I'm interested in as a researcher. I also think that, you know, in a world in which we come to rash conclusions about people based upon their appearance, being fat or obese is really shorthand for a lot of folks for being slovenly, lazy, out of control. I think folks have tried to challenge that, but it's an uphill battle, largely because some of the research, the community, and governments and policies and programs are based on evidence that suggests that being obese is a public health problem. And then just yesterday or 2 days ago, a massive study concluded that a number of people are miscategorized as being obese because of the body mass index, which is really problematic. I think Brad Pitt was obese according to the BMI. Yeah, at one point. So the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman talks in his best-selling book Thinking Fast and Slow about how we make decisions based on visceral feelings, strongly felt emotions that really can serve as poor guides. And he talks about the palpable fear of shark attacks in some of that work. And it's noteworthy that we pay more attention to the fear of being bitten by a shark because, well, sharks frighten us, even though there's evidence that riptides occur more frequently and may be equally lethal. So emotions can sometimes serve as poor guides, but in some cases, the fear of sharks actually works in some way to reduce the number of drownings, right? The question about language, I think this is where I would ask, we need to think more carefully about what the language of kindness and compassion obscures. The term itself is heavily invested in notions of charity, support for those who are well off, and in some cases, what has been done in the name of compassion is, in a word, cruel. I should say that my own thinking has been shaped by an engagement with disability studies. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with some of that work, but it's really forced me to rethink some key ideas at the center of my own thinking as a researcher, but also as a person, as a human being in this world. When we are kind to disabled people, are we respectful of them? Do we see them as full citizens with all the rights associated with citizenship? Is our kindness motivated by an interest in helping them or making ourselves feel better about appearing to help them? People talk about this halo effect, that you do good things, not because you give a crap about it, but because you like the feeling of helping. I say this because I think a discourse of kindness can be interpreted as somewhat infantilizing. There's nothing random about acts of kindness, and we should not fool ourselves into believing that there is. I'm not suggesting we abandon kindness, absolutely not, but I think the shift in language is less important to me than an engagement in what happens after kindness. What structures are changed? What actions flow from a kinder approach to governing? Kindness does not erase or wash away racism. As one critic said, a lot of you all are using kindness as a way to silence people who are suffering from oppression, injustice, and inequality. And some of you, I see you, are using kindness as a way to repackage and put a coating on white, rich privilege. But I'm saying it out of kindness because here's the deal, there's no kindness without justice. Folks might be familiar with Robin DiAngelo, who's written about this notion of the invisible knapsack. Thank you. To describe white privilege. And she explains most white people continue to conceptualize racism as isolated and individual acts of intentional meanness. This definition is convenient and comforting in that it exempts a lot of white people from the system of white supremacy we live in and are shaped by. It is at the root of the most common kind of white defensiveness. If racists are intentionally and openly mean, I'm almost done. Sorry. Then it follows that nice people can't be racist. Not meaning to be racist also allows for absolution. If they didn't mean it, it cannot and should not count, close quote. So in a strange way, sometimes the turn to kindness feels reminiscent of a debate that happened a long time ago about the need for communities to create social capital. A political scientist named Robert Putnam wrote this book called Bowling Alone a long time ago, saying that all these people are bowling, but they're not playing with people. They're just hanging out on their own. And sometimes it feels like that. It feels like, oh, just wouldn't it be great if you can ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar kind of thing. So, and the last question, how do different emotions constrain or enable progressive and inclusive policy outcomes? I just want to circle back to a point I made earlier that I don't think it's entirely appropriate to presume that good emotions lead to progressive or inclusive policy outcomes. I think that's a question. I think it's refreshing to see a political leader leading differently, leading with kindness and compassion. We see a bit of that in Canada, and it's been deeply problematic too. But I think it's a giant leap from that type of leadership and the kind of outcomes we want. And there are important reasons why it's critical to expand that thinking away from it being embodied in one person. It sets unreasonable do-gooder expectations and communicates the message that kindness and compassion are feminine traits. rather than actually feminist traits. And finally, emotions can only get us so far. What's needed, and what all of us need to commit to, is addressing in a profound way the structural features of our economy and polity that disadvantage certain members of our communities. It means looking at racism, colonialism, sexism. It means appreciating that racialized, Black, Indigenous people in our communities, the communities in which we work and live, have long historical reasons to be suspicious of all this talk about compassion and kindness. We need to ask members of those communities, many of whom are the target of a range of emotions, what it means to feel respected and valued. If we want to embolden communities and combat injustice, kindness and compassion are one step along that path. They are not, however, a substitute for the labor that must be collectively felt and enacted in the here and now. There you go. Can I go over?
Cool. Do I just start? All right. Excellent. Thank you. So yeah, tautoko, everything that this fine gentleman has just said. Kia ora tātou e te whānau. My name's Chlöe Swarbrick. I'm a Green. Don't hold that against me, but I'm more than welcome to take. Welcome any and all questions and or critiques, and I'll debate anybody. So I was just asked to offer some thoughts, and I've just been jotting a few things down, largely in response to some of the prompts that were just offered, but also stuff that's kind of come out of the notion of whether kindness is just rhetoric or it can meaningfully inform policy. And I've kind of got three broad things that I think are really worthwhile to investigate. The first is what we actually mean, to follow the lead, what we actually mean when we talk about kindness and about shame and about emotion in politics. Because I think that we can take quite a, and this is I graduated from here with a BA in philosophy, so I apologise everybody, but about kind of more Kantian or deontological ways of thinking about it, or more utilitarian consequentialist ways of thinking about it, and I'll unpack that in a second. Also about whether we can kind of end up in quite an Orwellian space where this is just a veneer to excuse behaviour that has always kind of been undertaken. The second is around the notion, which is really popular in politics over the last kind of 5 years, but particularly 2017, and I assume we'll see it again in 2020, around the notion of being evidence-based. And how that can occur. I don't believe it can occur in a vacuum, so we'll touch on that as well. And then thirdly and finally, the notion of kind of managerialism or professionalising politics, and how that is supposed to be about like a dude in a suit telling you the way that things are, and that's what politics is supposed to look like. And ultimately unpacking how I think that fundamentally all systems are the sum of their parts, and that is really important when you're considering things like culture and shared sets of values, which enable that structure. So on what I alluded to earlier around the different ways that you can interpret stuff like kindness and shame and emotion pertaining to policy, it's important, I think, to kind of look at it. Obviously, there's a spectrum, but for sake of the 10 minutes that I have, within the binary of kind of, are we approaching this from a Kantian or deontological perspective, that being, from the outset, are these the rules that we are setting in place, and are we then following those rules? Or are we more concerned about the consequences or the outcomes or what follows after we undertake certain behaviour, a more utilitarian or consequentialist approach? And I think that that is really important in conversations around policy. For example, the really controversial ones that I found a lot of politicians don't want to engage in, around things like drug addiction, which we were just talking about earlier. If you are to approach that from a kind of deontological or Kantian perspective of going, here is the shared set of rules, we don't want people to take drugs, then you may be able to, through the lens of kindness, perceivably justify locking people up, because you are taking a very paternalistic approach and saying you know better, and this is you being kind for the greater good. The greater good, however, does pertain to consequentialism, so park that. Whereas if you are to take an approach of kindness through a consequentialist lens, you may be more inclined to approach drug harm reduction you may be inclined to take that approach to the drug problem and say, hey, what we're actually worried about here is the outcomes or the consequences of the people who are put through this policy. So I think that is a really important distinction. And I think that is where we've heard, and I've definitely heard from screaming in the chamber over the past 2.5 years, that there is a lot of concern. You talk about kindness and particularly progressive politics. There is this real backlash from conservative forces who say, hey, the left didn't invent kindness. We can be quite kind as well. And again, that's the more kind of conservative way of kindness, which I think often manifests in a more paternalistic approach. But again, happy to unpack that further down the track. In terms of the kind of Orwellian language, I get really worried about how we're consistently still talking about kindness, but we haven't done things like actually meaningfully invest in raising certain numbers of people out of poverty through increases to benefit rates, called benefits, despite it being recommended by the Welfare Expert Advisory Group. So again, we're still using this kind of language, but the economic reform isn't necessarily being undertaken. There's also then leading into kind of the ideas of it being quite paternalistic. I think it's really important to think of it in terms of the policy approach, whether we are doing a top-down, hey, this is what I think kindness looks like, or it is a participatory form of kindness, which actually means operating from a collective basis, working with the people who are directly impacted, and the kind of buzzword nowadays is co-designing the approaches that we should be taking. But actually, I think it's fundamentally about ceding power, particularly if you want to talk about approaches to things like recognising the sustained impacts of things like colonisation on Indigenous populations, if you want to talk about accessible design for people with disabilities, if you want to talk about actually changing policy outcomes, stop doing the top-down thing and actually provide those levers of power for those who are directly impacted. The other thing around evidence-based or evidence-informed, the rhetoric that we hear from a lot of political parties, and I'm guilty of doing this in the past as well, is talking about being entirely evidence-based. Evidence is not value neutral. And there's been a lot of commentary about this. Someone in my immediate sphere that I think of is Dr. Jesper Ensign-Shaw, who really speaks about how the filters of life experiences and even the academia and commentary that we surround ourselves with ultimately inform, firstly, the things that we choose to study, but then secondly, the kinds of approaches that we take to that study. So that leads to massive swathes of gaps in the knowledge that we have in academia, which oftentimes means that we can overlook really, really critical things. But I think that that's also really important to think about in the context of politics, because, again, being evidence-based isn't it doesn't necessarily denote what the outcome is going to be. You can find evidence for almost anything, but it depends on the value weighting that you give to that, but also whether you are focused, again, on the outcome or whether you're focused on the immediate kind of intervention in that problematic behaviour or otherwise. So I had a really interesting debate. I'm actually currently doing postgrad study at Vic, I'm sorry. I had a really interesting debate with a lecturer there about how our Misuse of Drugs Act was fundamentally designed in the wrong way if the intention was to reduce people consuming substances. And her response, which I think is very apt, and kudos to her for saying this, is that actually it's perfectly designed because the intention was to put people who use drugs in jail. It wasn't to solve the problem. So again, this is the thing that I want to say about whether we're taking it from kind of a rules-based approach or we're focused on consequences and outcomes. And then just finally, I've got no idea how much time I've got left, so I'll just say I think that the other thing which is really quite disconcerting is the so-called professionalising of our politics. We have a representative democracy, right? That's the form of government that we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We do have the Westminster system, which is an inherently adversarial colonial system, which I would argue isn't quite fit for purpose in a country that was founded on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but parking that. I have found myself, and this is just for sake of bringing some personal reflections on this, getting really, finding myself oftentimes having to present or conform in certain ways in order to be taken seriously inside of that system. And I think that that is a real danger when we are talking about the need to bring values or emotions or humanity, God forbid, into our politics and into our policy. And I just really caution people against looking at politicians who stand up there and give off the vibe that they know everything, because if they present as such, I mean, first and foremost, anybody who says that they do is either lying to you or lying to themselves. I'm not sure which is worse. But there should be an open-mindedness to the approaches that our politicians are taking. But the big problem is that they operate largely in a soundbite media environment where changing their mind is characterised as flip-flopping. And that's where I think that the cultural side of things, that being the awareness and the conversations that we are having, is really critical. Because if we do want to start talking about things like kindness and how that manifests in public policy, then we need to have that room for those conversations, which are oftentimes more nuanced, complex and challenging than is offered in a mainstream media soundbite. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
So I think what they think. I have too much energy to sit down while I'm talking, so forgive me, I'll stand. Kia ora tātou, my name is Helen Robinson and I hail originally from Wellington. Have become inhabited here in Auckland, maybe even home in Auckland for about the last 10 years. So thank you for having me and us. I currently hold the role of General Manager of Social Services at the Auckland City Mission, and some of you will know of us and know of us well, and some of you will know a little bit. We represent on behalf of Auckland what is being known as one of the places that is Auckland's conscience, or Auckland's heart, I hope, or perhaps Auckland's hand. And certainly the challenge before me in a leadership role was to be all three, and in doing so reflect something of the fullness of our humanity. And it is perhaps the fullness of our humanity that we are here collectively talking about today. When I really started to look at the sentence that says why emotions matter in politics and policy, I think, why are we even having this conversation? Surely we're way past that question already. But obviously the fact that we're having this today is that we're not. The mission does a whole variety of work, and there are three areas, and Jennifer referenced the story about food security that I'll talk about in a minute. We do a whole heap of work working with people who are vulnerably housed or homeless, often street homeless. And in a context in 2013, it was declared that New Zealand had 40,000 people homeless, and that's really, or severely housing deprived as it was defined then. That is probably the best stat that I can give you, so you can imagine where we are now, 7 years on. And last year we did an assessment of how many people were street homeless in Auckland, and it came to about 800 people. I want you to imagine, if you can, just for a moment, the utter desperation, the utter sense of indignity and shame you must feel, one must feel, I must feel, you must feel, when I have nowhere to go tonight. Like, literally, what would happen to you when you left this door and this is your last toilet for the night, this is your last access to water, and you literally have nowhere to go. You can only imagine, and perhaps some of you in this room know something of that reality, actually, the deep, deep sense of fear and powerlessness and shame that one, that you, that I would feel if that was my experience today. And it is in that context of that person, of that structural reality that has gone on, of that set of thoughts, of feelings, that we as a nation are called to respond. That we as a nation, as a community, are called to create policy responses to. We are first and foremost human beings. and we bring each of us, unique to our own story and lenses, the fullness of what that means. And it is our utter stupidity to imagine anything else but. All we are doing is living in a grand reality of denial and even stupidity to imagine anything else but. Now that deep, deep, pervasive, strong, overwhelming, powerful sense of shame would be the most common story that I would hear in the thousands of people that we really have the privilege to be in relationship with each year. Whether that's people who are coming to our detox unit because of an addiction to alcohol or any other drug. Most people think that the 10 beds that we have are for people who live on the street, and at any one time there is only one person in there who is a rough sleeper. So that means 9 of those people are ordinary Aucklanders. That's you or me, who for whatever reason is struggling with the reality of alcohol or any other drug. You imagine a lifetime of it. For a moment, imagine it. And in fact, the conversation that we were talking about up here is that for most of us in this room, we don't have to imagine it. If it's not known a reality to ourselves, it's most often a reality we know of someone in our immediate circle, our family, our friends. The deep shame of being utterly powerless in response to alcohol or any other drug. If we meet that with any other reality than a full human response, then we are either living in a reality of denial or stupidity. It demands the best of us, the best of our empathy, the best of our understanding, the best of our thought, the best of our structure, the best of our policy response. And because we actually are not doing that, people are dying. Our family are dying. Our friends are dying. I am dying. That is the reality of our humanity. And again, I tell you another story, and probably the most common story that we hear in response to food insecurity. I've gone on record to say that 10% of New Zealand are food insecure. Tonight, 500,000 people in our country don't have enough food to eat. I'll say that again. Tonight, 500,000 people in our country don't have enough food to eat. And we're shocked. I'm shocked, and I should know better. At the Mission, we're the second biggest provider of food in our country and the biggest in Auckland, and we provided 23,000 food parcels last year to Aucklanders, every one of those with a street address. And the most pervasive story is the story that I hear of shame. Can you imagine what it would be like to come into a place like the Mission and say, I don't have any food for my children, help me please? Now, I have the privilege, because of the resource that I have, to understand that those drivers of food insecurity are structural. It is women who are bearing the burden of poverty in our country, it is Māori women, and it is Pacifica women. We as a country need to come to understand some sense of the reality of the denial that we are in. Our people, tonight are hungry. And again, that demands the best of us in response. The best of our kindness, the best of our empathy, the best of our compassion, the best of our thought, the best of our understanding, the best of our policy responses, the best of our evidence, the best of our reflection, the best of our conversation. It demands the best of us. And that, of course, includes how we feel. If we deny that reality, we are denying something of the human experience. And when I am hungry, it is a very human experience. It is not esoterical. It is not in my head. It is in my body. And because it is in my body and grounded in a very, very real, visceral experience, there is a set of consequences for that, certainly in my body, certainly in my emotions, and in my head and my thinking. Now, kindness at a very, very simple level becomes then a small but a significant antidote to that shame. Imagine what it would be like to walk in the door and say, I have nowhere to go tonight. Imagine what it would be like to walk inside the door and say, I need help. The reality of this alcohol thing has me licked. Imagine what it would be like to walk in the door and say, I am hungry, me and my family tonight need food. Our first response must be one of kindness. Otherwise, that sense of shame that is so pervasive will mean that I will run out that door and never come back. As a first responder to the very real reality of deprivation that is ours as a nation, blame who you will, but it is ours, it belongs to us all, is that human heart response. And then we must begin to ask why.
Mark.
I flick that on. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I might be the odd one out here. When I was, I've got to look at that. I might just move over here. Yeah. Might be easier. When I was actually contacted to come along tonight, my first reaction is, are you sure you got the right person? I'm not in politics. I'm not an academic. I'm not sure I've got particular expertise in this area. I was then persuaded, and I'll perhaps explain why I was persuaded, but also raised certain questions for me. When I read the brief, the PowerPoint that was sent up around the discussion, clearly emotion was brought up a lot as well. And so that stirred for me, well, what is kindness and why be kind? As two key questions. Hence the title I put there, When's Kindness? My background is primarily business. I was CEO of the Warehouse Group, which is a retail group with a number of different brands. I'm now on the board of a number of different companies and also quite a few not-for-profits. And so, hence my question, why me? When I said about why me, I was said, well, when you were CEO at the Warehouse, you did a number of kind things. I'm looking at Alice now, who was the person who asked me. And, I never thought of them as being kind. I thought of them as the right thing to do. Some of those things, for example, included the introduction of the career retailer wage, which was a massive increase in pay for most of the people working in the business. We were the first major company in New Zealand to introduce domestic violence policies. We have a lot of people, 12,000 employees. Domestic violence is an issue across all social demographics, sadly. And we felt it was something where we needed to put in place a policy that allowed people to take time out, especially when they were trying to get away from those situations, and do it in a way where there'd be no shame. When that came up, some of the people said, oh, it's not going to cost a lot of money. People could take advantage of it. The research we did said they won't. They're so ashamed that normally they won't even do anything about it. And that proved to be the case, actually. We had to actually actively encourage people to take advantage of that policy. Another thing was the Red Shirts in School program, which basically has put thousands of 17, 18-year-olds, given them their first ever work opportunity. And for a lot of them has led then to a career ladder. A career in retail, and retail is often looked down upon, quite frankly, by many people. A career that can be very, very fulfilling and rewarding for many people. And finally, we had big increases in engagement. Company engagement is a way companies try and measure feedback from employees on to whether they are engaged in the company, whether they think what they're doing is worthwhile, etc. So I suppose you could frame those up as kind. To me, I bring a personal perspective to that. We've all got a backstory. To me, they were good business, because to me, business is all about people. And it's all about people working together. And so it's not consequentialist in the sense, but to me, it's the right thing. So I want to unpack a little bit about that. This is a slide that we would use in team training. And this slide, and this is, I'll start to say why I'm a little bit not in total agreement with kindness as emotion, as primarily emotion. In team training, when you bring loads of people together, you bring diverse people together, we talk about going from judging to knowing to understanding to appreciating and then evaluating and valuing. To me, my little bit of nervousness with emotion primarily is defining kindness. Does that mean if we don't like someone, we shouldn't be kind to them? Does that mean that our immediate reaction to a different person is based on emotion? And the reason we started with that was to say, well, judging, we all characterize people, stereotype people, etc. It happens, it's what humans do. Just that's superficial. Get to know the person, their background, their story, their personality types, their tendencies. They're not annoying you on purpose. They might just have a different personality or approach to things. And I've never been in a group where you've done some team building work and where you don't move to appreciating. Human beings are amazing. And then, though, you do evaluate. You may give feedback that their behavior isn't acceptable. Is that unkind? Or is it more kind to be brave enough to say to someone you're being a dick? I don't know. Is there some kindness in that, if done appropriately? Hence my real, little bit cautiousness with framing kindness as mainly just an emotion. I do think acts of kindness elicit emotion. Acts of kindness should elicit emotion. They stir our spirit. Whilst we all get swamped with videos in Facebook, some of them do genuinely move you because they're kind. And so I'm not saying this is emotionless. For me, kindness is a behavior. It's an act. And that elicits emotion. And it's a virtue. It's a virtue of character. So this is moving on to a bit more my back story. And this perhaps is where I ask for kindness from some of you. Because I'm probably not in the majority here. I'm a Christian. I've got a degree in theology. I've got a master's in an area called Christian apologetics, which is about philosophy and theology, not just what you believe, but why you may believe it. I'm also a believer in free markets. I'm a believer in free markets while recognizing the danger of greed, which I think is a real issue, but because free markets raise people out of poverty. I see them as an act of kindness when done well. I work with lots of small businesses where those business owners are incredibly kind. So for me, free markets unleash creativity and release people to fulfill their potential. Now, the kindness I'm asking for is, are you on the judging end of the spectrum now, starting with me? Are you moving a bit? No, I'm a white male. Clearly, whiteness does bring privilege to some degree. But there's more to me than that. If you delve a bit further, you find I come from a very working class background in South Wales. Brought up in state housing. Youngest of 5 children. I've had 2 of my siblings die of alcoholism. Only person in my family to ever go past school at 15. You get my grandfather's birth certificate out, and it says X, the mark of Elias Powell. Couldn't read or write. A very working class context. Everyone's got a backstory. So this is why I'm cautious of kindness as an emotion. I'm cautious of jumping into that, because I think, to me, the core of kindness is, are you kind to everyone? Even if you don't like them, even if you disagree with them, and kind enough to listen to their opinions. For me, what underlies that is a view of what kindness is, what kind of thing kindness is. Again, my perspective on this isn't in a majority in New Zealand anymore. I'm what might be called an ethical realist, a moral realist. I believe kindness is a real virtue. It's a reality grounded in God, and therefore is objective. It's not just what society decides. My caution with society deciding what kindness is they might change their mind next week. So does might make right. And it might not be you in power next. So I have an objective view of kindness is, a virtue, a character to be grown. You look at the Bible, Galatians 5, a very famous verse for those who are Christians. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And the last bit of that verse, which I love, is there is no law against these things. You never outlaw kindness. It's a virtue, and we all recognize it's a good and a virtue, and that's why we respond to it with emotion. And why emotion can elicit kindness as well. So, for me, interesting topic. I don't claim particular expertise. I'm not a politician. The perspective I bring is that kindness, I do think, has an oughtness to it. An oughtness and a shouldness. I think it's good. And that, it's a good for society. I believe it is important to human flourishing, how we treat each other. And it's sadly lacking. And in some ways, it's got worse in our social media society, where when people disagree with each other, they just move into their own little bubbles and become an echo chamber with each other and then hate on each other. So I think we've got even more need for kindness as a virtue in our society. And for me personally, kindness is a matter of the human heart and character, and the more we can have, the better. And the more we have, the more our society will flourish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all four speakers. So the floor is now open. I have one question on Slido here, but are there any questions from the floor? I'll take, okay, so 1, 2, 3. Now, the 4. So that, I've got one. Yeah. Oh.
Do you want to just repeat the question?
We can share this way. And this will ensure that all of us answer well, not me personally, but you four answer the question. So we're going to, that's the question rule. I forgot to mention at the start. No statements, please, just questions. So yes, it's about lived experience, but, and one day we'd love to hear yours, but not right now. Okay, so we'll go here first. Yeah, I'm a chair. Here, just here.
Thank you. Question for Mr. Green.
Can you pop it up closer to your... Yeah, perfect.
Question.
It's on.
It's on. You just need to hold it quite close, so by your chin.
Question.
Yes.
Is Jonathan Boston recently wrote a book, which he talked about last Thursday night. One of his areas of study showed that New Zealand had become much less empathetic in recent years than it was at the time of the introduction of the welfare state. And I wondered what we could put that down to. My second question is to Mr. Powell, and it is relating to the free market. I can believe in the market, but I can no longer believe in the free. Why should it be free? Thank you.
Kia ora. So where is the microphone? We'll start here with Michael, and then everybody gets a chance to say something. So off you go.
Well, we have a welfare state in Canada too. It's a bit frayed, but I guess my quick answer would be on the question of the welfare state is it's largely a result of attacks on the largesse, the welfare cheats. That is a discourse that sort of moved across a number of different geographic spaces. The idea that it's not surprising that at the beginning, sort of a post-Second World War, we saw a growing empathy, but there were organized forces attacking the idea that folks were basically benefiting, freeloading. Much of this had a racialized context in places like the United States and stuff like that. So I think it's not by happenstance that happened. I think there were calculated forces that were designed to attack the sources of the welfare state and that brought on, of course, the kind of leaner, meaner welfare state that we now see in many different contexts.
How can that be counted?
Yep,
Okay,
next.
go.
Yeah. So I was born in 1994. Which is the year Kurt Cobain died, but it also is well after the 1980s reforms in this country, which obviously coincided internationally with economic reforms that were occurring. And I think the association of those changes in the market to the welfare state and to our value system are perhaps best embodied in Margaret Thatcher's "There is no such thing as society, there is only men and women or individuals." And I think that movement from a more collectivist way of thinking about society and the social contract into everyone out for themselves is largely where that empathy has started to erode. And I think that is where we have begun to enable notions like the deserving poor, the undeserving victim or the deserving victim. And we have begun to turn away from, even though it's very much evidence-based or evidence-informed, we haven't been as inclined to look at the evidence and the research around intergenerational poverty and intergenerational criminality, instead preferring cultural explanations about people being inherently bad or mad or however you want to characterise it. So I think that is largely it, that it has been about this movement towards individualism. And when you have that movement towards individualism, you have politicians largely and people who are benefiting from sitting at the top of the pile, who politically benefit when they are able to perpetuate stories about the immigrants or whomever who are stealing our jobs. And they say that they will bring you into their privilege club when it is convenient, but not when it requires paying their fair share of tax. That we are, not doing particularly well because of them. But those people who are immigrants or whomever is the scapegoat of the day politically, are just people like us who are trying to make the best possible lives for themselves, for their families, and the best possible future for their kids. So I think that the solution politically, and I think about change in two broad spheres. So there's the structural side of things, which is the legislation, regulation, taxation, subsidies, incentives, contracts, treaties, is one side of things. But the other side, which I think is far more important and often neglected, is culture. And culture, by definition, is a shared set of values. And it is fundamentally about awareness. We often use culture as synonymous with ethnicity or religion or someone's geographical background. Those are not exactly the same thing. They are not synonymous, but they can be proxies to understand values. So different touch points for those kind of cultural changes are things like education, media, including diversifying our media landscape, Social media is a big part of that as well, and collective action and community building. So it's broadly about changing the conversation by way of the people who participate in it. We need more regular people engaged in politics, and we need to stop this awful feedback loop, which is disengagement as a result of poor behaviour. So what we've seen, to give you a really tangible example, with the last kind of fortnight of events in Parliament, 2 out of 5 political parties now embroiled in cases before the Serious Fraud Office, a lot of people were going, all politicians are the same, broad brushstroke, it's all bullshit, and I don't want to engage in it. That gives licence and excuse for bad behaviour to continue when you decide to opt out of that system. The bad guys get away with it when you are not part of it. So we need more people to recognise their inherent power in engaging in representative democracy. And the best example that I can give is I genuinely think that if I can get into Parliament, anybody can.
There's one specific question you asked me as well, but I will make a comment on the welfare state. Again, in my personal context, my family, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, welfare state's been important. My sister's a single mother, has really never worked for paid work. Both my brothers, one had an interesting discussion. One I described as a functional alcoholic, the other dysfunctional. The dysfunctional alcoholic was important, that support. So, and if you then cast your mind back to where we were, we're in a very different place to where we were in the 1930s. I do wonder whether by having the welfare state, though, people go, well, the state takes care of that. I pay my tax, they take care of that. Rather than, could I get involved in something? Could I do something with a charity? Could I do something in my local community that contributes? I wonder whether part of the disengagement is that's what the state does. I pay my tax. That's it. Just wonder as well. And I don't think the state is brilliant at delivering lots of things at the time, all the time. I do wonder about that. I do wonder whether local-based, and agreeing with Chlöe, local-based people doing things themselves, perhaps with state support, but more decentralized, is a better way of engaging. But I'll leave the welfare state question as a massive, complex issue, because the root causes also need to be looked at, intergenerational, as you touched on, etc. Is a very complex issue. I'm someone who accepts that in that overall system there can be a lot of waste, but it's still worth doing overall as well. And I think most people do, quite honestly. On the free market question, the more fuller phrase I use is reasonably regulated free markets. I think one of the biggest threats to markets at the moment are not being free is monopolies. And power does corrupt. I'm a decentralist by inclination, because power does corrupt. We are brilliant as human beings at rationalizing our behaviors and what we do and what we think. And when you're in power, people suck up to you, and you get convinced by your own BS. So I'm a decentralist by nature, and I think the free part of markets is really important. And what concerns me is large companies like Google, Facebook, etc., who have enormous power now, Apple. And I believe competition is a massive check and balance against the exploitation of power and helps free markets. In New Zealand, we have a major problem with competition. And for me, more immigration is important for New Zealand, so we get a bigger population, so we can get more competition. We've only got 2 food retailers. Now, I know the CEO of Foodstuffs. I know the last CEO will still convince themselves they're working hard and doing the best for their customers. They're well-meaning people. But if Aldi came in tomorrow, food prices in this country would drop 20%. The problem we haven't got is we haven't got a big enough economy to have 3, 4, 5 large companies in every vertical. Yeah? When 2 Degrees came into telco, I was a big supporter of them. I was their first customer in the warehouse. We came under enormous pressure from Spark and Vodafone not to go with them overall. They have completely aided the consumer in New Zealand by getting more competition. So I agree with you. There are issues with free markets. There needs checks and balances. There needs checks and balances against power. I think reasonable regulation is important. So I'm not a laissez-faire free market person in that sense. But don't take the pendulum so far over there, because wealth generation is needed to pay for things. Because the government gets basically taxes off you and I working, taxes off businesses, and taxes on GST from economic activity. So businesses are critical to that, and I think the free markets operating well with reasonable checks and balances, and has been evidence-based the last 20, 30 years, suggests that lifts people out of poverty and is enormously important. Don't lose the sight of me, though. Greed in the human heart is a massive issue. Power is a massive issue. And so checks and balances, yes, but don't kill the golden goose.
Okay, Helen, can I ask, we actually have a specific question for you too. So answer those ones, and I'm going to add another one. How can we show kindness towards people who we see as street homeless?
2 good questions. Without reading Jonathan Boston's book that I haven't, or the evidence behind what you talked, my experience is that New Zealand is not less empathetic, actually. In fact, it would probably be the inverse. So I don't know what he's experienced. I don't know obviously what evidence he's based his.
My experience. He has laid down my experience.
Yeah. So I guess part of the privilege of being in the epicentre of a very small organisation, really, who deal with a lot of people who are very, very desperate one way or another, is that it also draws the extraordinary sense of all the good stuff about our humanity. It would be a daily experience that I am overwhelmed by the sense of generosity, empathy, kindness, compassion, commitment, that all kinds of people, from stranger to unstranger, whatever the opposite of an unstranger is, familiar, really, really is. I am, as much as I am deeply ashamed by our country, I am deeply proud. And those two things coexist in my daily reality anyway. In terms of responding to people who are street homeless, Chlöe and I met today, and I was talking to her about this. One of the things that happens when you become street homeless, it's really easy to be put into, I think Chlöe referred to this, a kind of other camp. And in fact, the kind of language that I try to use is, I'm not homeless, I'm just experiencing it. So it is that sense, actually, I'm first a human being that then maybe tonight doesn't have anywhere to go. And my very, very genuine response, without wanting to be naive or trite, is actually just say hello. Like, build a genuine relationship with someone. And it really helps if that person who is street homeless is someone that you see regularly, because genuine relationships take time. And in a genuine relationship, I wouldn't come along and give you my whole life story because you're sitting down offering me a hamburger. Actually, you might get my name if you're lucky. Because genuine relationship is built intimacy by intimacy, trust by trust over time. So my response is, where possible, go into genuine relationship. And if that can't be with that individual who you are seeing on the street, there are all kinds of really awesome organisations in our country that are. I happen to belong to one, but I'm very, very happy to say that there are many others that are doing very, very good work with people who are street homeless or vulnerably housed generally.
Great. So what I'm conscious of is that took quite a while to get round, and so we've got 7 minutes left. So what I'm going to do with the 2 questions that I've got here is take them back to back, and one other, because I'd really like a youth adjacent or a non-boomer to ask a question. So I'm going to take one up here and then one down here. So we're going to keep them really short.
Hi, I've got a question for Chlöe related to what you were saying about deontology and utilitarianism, and you seem to come across as a little bit consequentialist, when I would tend to think of things like social justice and human rights and even kindness in itself, and taking the point about kindness being a behaviour rather than an emotion, as deontological, really, that they're just the right thing to do. And sure, I think a certain amount of what's achieved is important, but yeah, just wondered your thoughts on that.
Thanks. Next one up here in the middle. Can you just show Suzanne where you are? Cheers.
Question for Mark, but thank you, Helen, for mentioning feminisation of poverty. In the work that a lot of us did in Child Poverty Action Group, a lot of the people getting food parcels were actually employed and working at the warehouse. So, Mark, my question is, in terms of kindness, did it ever occur to you and the board to turn the warehouse into a cooperative where the chief executive is only paid 3 times more than the lowest paid worker?
Can you pass that microphone up to the man in the white shirt, please?
Hello, my name is Caleb. My background is in studying radicalization, specifically radicalization online. I spend a lot of time talking to white nationalists, specifically young white nationalists, a growing problem, as you guys are probably well aware. So my question is, there's a paradox of tolerating the intolerant. White nationalists will oftentimes use liberal values, democracy, freedom of speech to insert themselves into the dialogue and then co-opt it. And then once they get their way, they will obviously do away with those principles. But I often do think about showing kindness to those people, and through my de-radicalization efforts, I do show a lot of kindness. But I was wondering what the panelists, if they have any thoughts on that, how do we show kindness to some of the most intolerant in our society, and sometimes the people we have the least amount of empathy for?
Okay, and I've got one more down the front here. Sorry, Suzanne, I'm making you work out. And while that one's coming up, I do have one for Michael, I think, but others. Could you talk about the relationship between the BMI and eating disorders, particularly diagnosis and then access to services? Or anybody can jump in on that, but that, you know.
Thanks, guys. I enjoyed all of your presentations immensely. My question is about how we make space for emotions more generally, and to think about that in the context of gender, and also thinking about experiences of Māori. And I'm thinking particularly about anger, and the space of anger in politics, and how we make space, I guess, maybe not only about anger, but, you know, we're often told that any kind of emotion outside of sort of straight up and down rational argument is somehow kind of an excuse to dismiss the source of those emotions. And so I want to kind of understand how we can make more space for a broader range of emotions within our politics and within our policy.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say a quick thanks very much to Chlöe, because she's going to run in 5 minutes and we might not get through everyone's answers in 5 minutes. So we're going to let Chlöe answer first. Yep. And if she suddenly disappears, can you just start clapping on her way out?
Yeah, you don't have to do that. Okay, there's a lot of questions and I have a lot of notes. So on the first question around human rights being deontological, I absolutely agree about human rights. And we are in a really interesting space at the moment in this country with the example right now of whether prisoners should have the right to vote, for example. And right now, you know, we are seemingly in this bizarre space where we are rationalising the right limit on the human right to engage in politics, and you know, this is just our position is that all prisoners should be enfranchised as the Greens, but that is not a position shared across Parliament. And where we've got to is the reinstatement of prisoner voting rights for those serving less than 3 years. But anyway, so right now the conversation does appear to very bizarrely be about human rights because they're deserved, not because we are human. But I think that diverges from the more kind of grey area of policy where there is ambiguity about how to get the best types of results around where, for example, or what programs you invest in housing or in, better justice outcomes in terms of, victims feeling better about the process or whatever the case may be. So I think that human rights and those basic fundamental principles are probably quite distinct from other policy areas. With regard to intolerance and radicalisation, oh my God, I could speak for ages about this. I gave a speech in Parliament last year when deplatforming was a very big topic of conversation around the two Canadians. We've got them here though, so don't worry about that. I think it was really important to re-emphasise that, freedom of speech is not entitlement to a platform. It's not entitlement to people to have to listen to, and it's definitely not entitlement to have a barrier from critique. And where I think that there is space, particularly for somebody with privilege like me, is not necessarily to provide a platform of debate per se with somebody who is promoting quite vile and quite regressive opinions, but it is to make the space to have a conversation with them in private to be able to peel through all of those layers and find shared humanity. And I do ultimately think that it is about finding that space of empathy, but you can't do that on a platform where everybody's trying to beat each other. And that's the big problem I find with the debate format of YouTube and politics nowadays. And I definitely think it's why politics has become so polarised, or one of the many contributing factors. The thing around making space, particularly for anger, I think that we can't do that in the kind of Westminster system politically that we have at present. I think the only way that we are going to be able to facilitate a better systemic way, and I'm talking here about parliamentary politics, others I'm sure will have opinions around business and NGOs and academia and otherwise and in broader society, but it has to be a more collaborative, creative environment. Adversarial parliamentary politics, particularly our colonial Westminster system, breeds throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and it breeds that kind of soundbite media environment, which is literally just about clicks and controversy. It's not about having a nuanced, complex, human, emotive argument or debate or conversation. So I think something that is more so founded on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and on tikanga would be far better for that kind of approach. I also just want to say, if I can, because I've got the microphone and I'm a politician, on the point of philanthropy, and I'm sorry I can't hear your response, but I just wanted to say just my 2 cents on it. Is that whilst I absolutely think that the role of NGOs in our society to seek to solve some of these massive problems that we've got is so fundamentally critical, unless we are addressing the pipeline that is producing these problems, we are never going to solve it. So I really worry about things like philanthropy, for example, being held out as a solution when actually what we may need is systemic transformation in the form of better redistribution from the outset so people aren't having to go through this trauma and isolation and present with problems. Thank you.
Just wait for her to just give you a minute. Thank you very much. All right, thanks. Michael.
How can I follow that up? I'll just take a couple. The first one about anger, and specifically, I think what some of my thinking has sort of evolved around this, but it's not so much the emotion. It really is what it becomes attached to, and that people who sort of study emotions always keep saying that they shift, they move, they're constantly evolving, and anger in the context of the Me Too movement, in the context of radical AIDS activism and LGBT activism, was a really productive, progressive political force. So, in the way that the anger that's mobilized by alt-right or the far radical right is corrosive, I think, of democracy. And we also, I think, in terms of thinking about culture, pay attention to why particular people are not permitted to be angry. Why are black women always told, why are you angry? I was in Canada, there was a debate at one point about a disabled woman who got very angry when a perfect stranger who thought they were being really kind, decided they were just going to start pushing her wheelchair. And for her, that was an attack on her, and she got very angry, and people were like, the person was only trying to be kind and nice. So, but one has to sort of acknowledge a space for saying that for someone who has mobility issues, who uses a wheelchair, someone taking over their wheelchair is a personal, it can be seen as a personal attack. On the issue of the radical right, I want to plug this book by Arlie Hochschild, Strangers in Their Own Land. I think what she tries to connect with, she's a kind of lefty, progressive sociologist at Berkeley, one of the more progressive places in all the world, and she went off to talk to Trump supporters and Tea Party supporters. And what she found and what she kind of mobilizes in this book is the notion of what she calls a deep story. And it doesn't mean that you have to sort of be an apologist for racists or radical far-right folks, but it means understanding how facts never sort of enter in the realm of that deep story, and the way folks understand themselves and their relationship to others is framed by that shared story, which they feel is right. And I think we, in some ways, we try to kind of avoid that kind of engagement with folks who we fundamentally disagree with. I don't necessarily want to hang out with those folks, but what she does in a sort of not sympathetic, but a really kind of, I think, an illuminating way is try to understand and explain how folks connect with others in ways that we might say is against their own economic interests, is against their own political interests. So. Maybe the BMI.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question was about me being paid a ridiculous sum of money, which is actually a quote I ended up having 15 minutes of fame for in the papers in New Zealand, where I was asked, is what you earn a lot of money? I said, yeah, of course it is. It's a ridiculous amount of money. So you can't deny that. Now, that was pretty radical for a CEO to say that, and hence I ended up in quite a few newspapers questioning it. But there is a but to that. I think the ability for people to question that, challenge that, and for public companies is valid, and I've got no problem with that. I don't believe in equality of outcomes. I believe in equality of opportunity for people. And I think in the imperfect world we're in, that financial reward is something people will strive for. And you could say unfortunately, but that's the case. And it does act as a motivator for hard work, and it does act as a motivator for initiative, creativity, risk. And I think that's good as well. Now, how much is too much then is a valid challenge and a question that comes through. And yeah. I think the other side of the coin, though, is you don't know what those people do with that money. Yeah. And it's back to that question I raised earlier. We are dealing with questions of the human heart. And I'm not going to say what I do with my money, it's that, etc. But City Mission wouldn't exist if you didn't have some very wealthy people helping you build your new building. Stephen Tyndall personally put half his wealth into the Tyndall Foundation. And that foundation, every single not-for-profit I've been involved with, and I've been involved with a lot, goes to the Tyndall Foundation. It has contributed hugely to the society in New Zealand overall. So, look, we can come out with challenges, and I think that's good. But I think for us to just knee-jerk go to let's redistribute, let's all make everyone equal, actually what's proven is there is a human condition that will corrupt that. And far-left policies have never been successful in producing freedom and initiative and equality in the end. So I react very carefully, whilst a very generous capitalist and a very conscious capitalist, to some pendulum swings I see going on, that let's not go back and make mistakes of history overall. Because whilst I'm a conservative, I have a strong liberal streak. And that liberal streak is about people's freedom to do stupid things a lot of the time, and freedom to believe things I may not disagree with. So swinging into the question on deplatforming largely, I think deplatforming is really dangerous. Recently, Peter Singer was stopped speaking at Sky City. I disagree with Peter Singer's philosophy on life completely. He believes young children should be able to be aborted, euthanized, use whichever word you want to use, up to the age of 2. Because he has a functional view of humanity. He doesn't believe there's an essence to us being human. He doesn't believe there's an intrinsic worth. We're just another species. And he is very honest to his philosophy. And rightly, people with Down syndrome or disabilities were upset about him coming to speak here. But again, if we define everything by emotion and start deplatforming people, they go underground. And when they go underground, they get angrier overall. Sometimes you should just let people speak and trust that people will see them for the idiots they are. And I've got a great faith that people will see those things when they're exposed. It's when they go underground it gets really dangerous. Or when there becomes this massive bubble where it's all groupthink. It's really interesting being British, because Brexit comes up. Everyone goes, oh, Brexit is terrible, terrible, and they expect you to just join in. I'm from South Wales. Working class South Wales voted hugely for Brexit. My brother, a green voting, left-wing as you can get, and Chloe would love that, voted for Brexit. These are complex, deep issues. They're not simplistic, or they're all racists. They're not at all. And I think what I'm seeing in this shame-based stuff often, and the want to deplatform and shame, is it will push people underground, and that's dangerous. Let people who've got views speak, argue against the ideas kindly, and the battle of ideas will win. Because we all know racism is fundamentally wrong. It undermines the intrinsic worth of every human being and their ability to flourish. And I don't know if you've watched Louis Theroux's documentaries. Yeah, they're brilliant. Because he goes and meets all these people and just lets them speak. And you end up going, they're idiots. But he just lets them speak in a very kind way. So for me, deplatform is extremely dangerous. And that cuts across all range of views. And because underlying deplatforming can lead to dehumanizing. And as soon as we can dehumanize a group of people, we can exclude them, and we can punish them, and then we can kill them. Last book to read, Ordinary Men, is a book interviewing Nazis. Not Nazis, actually. Most of them weren't Nazis. A battalion of ordinary men from Hamburg who killed 50,000 Jews in Poland, interviewed in the 1960s. And the title, it's not a Christian book, it's got no view, it's a study of them. What's scary about it is they were ordinary men. If we just dehumanize people, send them out, we will make mistakes of history. Let ideas come out, let's debate them civilly, and trust the people in democracy to make the right decisions. Perhaps I'm naive, but I think I've got history on my side to a large degree.
Just say one thing. Just respond to something in 2 minutes.
I think I know the ability to create space makes a difference everywhere.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to ask Alice Mills to come and close for us. So.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Alice Mills. I teach and research criminology here at the university. And before I close this event and ask you to thank our fabulous speakers one more time, I just want to make a few kind of brief reflections or comments on what we've heard today. So it seems, despite the kind of growing recognition on the importance of kindness and our shared humanity in some of the public discourse in New Zealand at the moment, one of the key themes to come out, particularly in terms of the speakers, was about that darker side of kindness and the way in which kindness can be quite paternalistic, used as a veneer, essentially to justify an emotion, essentially to justify policies, which are particularly likely to target those who are the most marginalised in society. So, for example, those experiencing addictions, those in poverty, and those who have offended against the law. The consequences of that, of course, are unlikely to be kind, but likely to go a substantial way to furthering the sense of shame amongst those people, but also, of course, their whānau and potentially their wider communities as well. It also means that structural inequalities, particularly those within the context of colonisation, remained unchallenged and untackled. However, one of the things that I think has come through as well throughout these speakers is about the importance of kindness. That we shouldn't abandon the notion of kindness. As Mark said, it's important to our sense of it's a human flourishing, but it's also important in the sense of tackling some of those issues, addiction, poverty and homelessness, and to reduce that sense of shame. As Helen pointed out, this demands the best of us, and I think that's a particularly good way of putting it. This demands the best of us to be kind also to those who, on a personal level, we may not particularly like. To be kind to a certain degree, at least to hear some views that we may not particularly like. But this is also, this notion of it demanding the best of us is particularly important in terms of an election year, where, of course, we need to also demand the best of our politicians and always, of course, demand the best of our policymakers. So can I ask you, please, to put your hands together one more time to thank our fabulous speakers and, of course, also our chair, Professor Jacinda Ardern.